Are clinical trials done carefully and scientifically and with no bias? Is it true that a pharmaceutical company can do 10 clinical trials for a drug and only report on one of them and ignore the other 9 if they didn't like the results of that trial?
It's really remarkable to me. One of the great untold stories, it's told but doesn't get enough attention, is how the average person, if you ask them about clinical trials and they hear that a drug has passed 3 clinical trials, they think that's really the stamp of approval, that it means it's safe, it's proven it doesn't have side effects, and that the FDA has been on top of it. And it doesn't mean that at all. As a matter of fact, it's remarkable that drug companies are able to conduct their own test and then hold them back, as a matter of fact, if they don't like the results, and go ahead and submit only the ones that they want. And this happens time and time again. I repeatedly go through instances inside the book in which this has happened. And just last week, as a matter of fact, here we are in February of now, we're talking of 2021. It continues to come out. There are new cases. The state of Hawaii, the Attorney General, had sued Bristol Myers Squibb and Sanofi, the French company, for the marketing of their blockbuster drug Plavix. It's sort of a blood thinner. It's brought in $50 billion in revenue to Bristol Myers over the years, and another $20 billion in revenue to the French company that was their partner. And what did they do? We now know from this lawsuit, they were fined $865 million. They had a study in the very beginning when the drug was approved in 1998 that showed that the drug was not assimilated as well by non-Caucasians, so by East Asians, by Asians, by anybody from China, by Black, by African Americans, by Blacks in Africa. They didn't get the full benefit of the drug. So what does that mean? Not only was the drug likely wasted on them, but in addition, they might have had a higher incidence of heart attacks and strokes over the years, the very thing the drug is supposed to stop. Every time in the next 10 years, 12 years, that came up as an issue inside the company, their internal emails show that they said, oh, we don't want to go there. We don't want to do that research because we know what it might show. The FDA eventually forced them to put it on their label in 2010. Guess why? Not because they did the research, but because independent researchers without any tie to the drug companies were doing it around the world. So this is amazing to me that we're in a situation in which the drug companies, who should have an obligation legally, which they don't, morally, which they pay no attention to disclose information that they know about when it may be that their drug is causing an injury to one or more people out there or to tens of thousands of people. It gets pushed under the rug. And then what happens? They pay a fine, $1 billion fine, a $5 billion fine, in this case, $865 million. And you know what it is? It's the cost of doing business. They have made so much money from the profit of these drugs over time that they're willing to pay that fine, and they still are not dissatisfied with it. Nobody goes to prison. You never hear about prison sentences. I never see perp walks with big pharma executives, very, very seldom. And maybe if we saw more of them, there might be a difference. But until that happens, you're going to continue to see this play out.
Do doctors get the scientific information about drugs?
So on the recent decision in Hawaii, the Attorney General getting a judgment of nearly $1 billion against Bristol Myers Squibb for not marketing correctly and holding back the key information about how their drug might affect tens of millions of people. I tried to place that story and an editorial about it at the New York Times, at the Washington Post, at the Wall Street Journal, went along to the Boston Globe and the Chicago Tribune, and nobody was interested. They have run stories about it in Bloomberg Law, and they've had stories about it in Reuters, but you won't read about it in the mainstream press because the figure, $865 million, isn't viewed as blockbuster enough. It's not $10 billion. The drug is Plavix. It's a little bit off the radar for a lot of people. It's not something that everybody can relate to. And that's the problem. I realized when I recently went through this, if the mainstream media takes a story like this, which is almost $1 billion fine for this type of injury, and says, oh, that's interesting, but it sounds the same as everything else we've heard in the past. That's the problem. It does sound like what we've heard in the past because this is what happens. This is the modus operandi inside the pharmaceutical industry. They do things that are wrong. They put people's lives at risk sometimes. They hide the information. Then they get caught. Then they pay a fine. And the mainstream press is so accustomed to it, they don't cover it, not because they're part of a conspiracy, not because somebody calls them up and says, don't do it. They're afraid they're not going to get enough clicks on their website or enough people reading it because it sounds too similar. That's really a bad stage we're at if that's the case.
Do doctors get the scientific information about drugs directly from the drug company? And is this a problem?
There's no question that the fact that the pharmaceutical companies supply the scientific information to the doctors is a major problem for two reasons. I discuss inside the book where back in the 1960s, some of the people marketing drugs at that time, when there was a much smaller number of drugs on the market, they realized that doctors in their practices were getting overwhelmed with the amount of information they had. So you were doing a family practice as a physician, and there were literally 400 new drugs approved in the previous year. You're getting information and you're getting salespeople coming in, so-called detail teams trying to sell you the drugs, drug representatives. And what happens is you can't process all of it. So you can't read all of the scholarly information on it. So you go instead by what the drug companies tell you are the highlights. You have to believe their promotion. You have to believe their sales from their drug reps. And some of the drug companies actually thought that there was a benefit to what they called the confusion factor. And it literally comes in from one of their memos. The fact that the doctors were so overwhelmed with information, they wouldn't be able to do their independent research. And so what you get today is you find that doctors are increasingly specialized. So you'll have a doctor who's looking only at one specific area as an internist. Somebody else is just doing neurology. Somebody else is just following diabetes. They know their specific area, but then they don't know outside of that. Yet what happens? You get an internist, let's say, who's a specialist on their cardiovascular doctor, and yet they happen to be prescribing in their practice 30% of their prescriptions may in fact be for psychological reasons, may in fact be for depression, things they know nothing about because they have patients coming to them for heart disease and then saying, by the way, doctor, I'm a little depressed. The doctor says, well, why don't we give you Xanax? Why don't we give you, a new SSRI that's out or a new antipsychotic, without knowing much more than what the drug company has told them. So this is, I think, in the end, incredibly dangerous. The people who are supposed to be the guardians of our health, the physicians, because they are supposed to weed through what's oversell from the pharmaceutical companies, aren't doing that.